today we're going to continue in Colossians chapter 3. If you were following the services on Sunday, we're doing Colossians 3:18 to 4:1. Now, Paul, you may remember, has been saying to us, live your lives in a manner worthy of the Lord. He said that in chapter 1. And today we're fleshing that out. So we're putting on the clothes of Christ and we're putting straight our relationships and the power we have in them. That's really the key for today. And this includes in our family life, and for some of us in our parenting, and also in our work lives, where we spend most of our time, even more now, especially in families. Now, did you notice here in Colossians 3, there are three pairs of people that Paul is speaking to. There are wives and husbands, children and parents, and there are slaves and masters. And what you're going to notice today too is that Paul, the first person in the pair he speaks to, is the one who is considered the most vulnerable, at least in the first century. But then we're going to notice God doesn't say to that vulnerable person first, name your rights, name them and claim them over the other person with all the power. He doesn't say that. Instead, he says to both people in the pair, here is what you need to do to give to the other in each of those pairings. It's very fascinating. So let's take a look. First up, wives and husbands. Verse 18, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, in verse 19, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Now, this is a tough thing to talk about, isn't it, in 2021? Things are so different to what they were in the first century. Totally different power dynamic, totally different status for women over those 21 centuries. So, we may be horrified when we hear that word submit. Wives, you are not slaves, I hope, in your marriages. What's interesting about the first century things that Paul says here to the wives too there were limits on this submission, sensible limits for the wives as they did this. As is fitting in the Lord, Paul said. In other words, you weren't to submit to your husband in a way that made you sin. Look at Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5. There's the warning there. And you weren't to endure violence or abuse either, and neither are you today. Most definitely not. But in any event, I don't think that's really the main principle to take out of what Paul says for women and men here. I think in our marriage relationship, we have a certain level of power, each of us, that we bring into our marriages and we have in our marriages. Yet instead of wielding that power to serve our own selves and over our spouse and to hurt our spouse, God is saying we're instead to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's Ephesians 5:21. Paul says it there too. Now that's going to look different in every marriage relationship because there's slightly different power dynamics in every relationship, isn't there? And it doesn't mean we've got to stop being an individual either. In every marriage, there's the me, there's the us, and there is Jesus. Now we'd never give up the me. We're still individuals, but the individual, I guess, is second in place to being the us, what's best for us in marriage. And that us is always in reference to Christ, what is best for Christ with us together in marriage. Christ's transforming power in our marriages is going to produce in our marriages a voluntary, Christ-honouring give and take in our marriage relationship. In other words, we're going to disagree in certain things, we always will. But we're going to make compromises to our stance in order to honour the Lord and come up with the best solution that's best for the us as a married couple and that honours Christ. And we're going to do that by respecting the other, not being hurtful or being harsh and selfish. For example, in my marriage, if my wife said, I've seen a great job opportunity in South Australia. Well, my role, I think, under Christ is to work out the best possible solution. Can it happen? This is all hypothetical, of course. What can we do to make that happen? We'll have a discussion about that, a respectful loving. We'll cover all the different options and come up with the best solution we can. I'll compromise, and maybe my wife will too, out of reverence for Christ and in love for one another, to come up with a solution. We're not going to ridicule each other, be mean and hurtful. We'll love each other and submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So we're individuals, but also a couple in Christ. It's radical stuff. And if we get into an argument, well, speaking from a husband's point of view, husbands, we're not going to get harsh with our wives. We're going to really work to listen, be respectful, hear what our spouse is saying. We're not going to dredge up past hurts and make sweeping statements like, you always do that, you never do this for me, because that doesn't honour Christ or our marriage particularly. We're going to leave behind harsh words like that, aren't we? We're going to get back in there. We're going to resolve our differences as best we can before the night is out. And we're going to bear with one another and forgive one another, just as Paul said earlier in Colossians 3. This is what it means to mutually submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Then we get to children, and it says fathers, but the original Greek word actually can mean parents. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, parents, do not embitter your children, or they'll become discouraged. I think the fact that children were meant to hear this letter being read out is pretty cool, don't you think? Children were part of church, very much so. Now, children, you have your own relationship with Jesus. So in verse 20, it says, children, obey your parents. Now, that is God's wisdom in the family relationship. He's saying, please obey your parents in everything. Now, I guess the qualification there is, if you disagree with mum or dad or your carer, I'm sure there is space to gently ask questions where you can clarify what your parents or your carer is saying to you, and respectfully where your parents are coming from, and present your case with kindness and gentleness and the fruits of the Spirit. And if nothing comes of that, nothing comes of that. Parents, don't provoke your kids or shut them down, which only frustrates your kids and embitters them against you anyway. Especially teenagers, I'm sure you'll know. Now, how do we make our kids bitter? Well, we make our kids bitter by giving them the feeling they don't count for much. They've just got to stand to attention whenever we're in the room. Instead, God would have our kids know how much we care for them, how much we appreciate them, as we care for them and we instruct them in life and speak the truth in love. In love, we show them we care about them. We appreciate it when they do the right thing. You know, it's a love relationship, not a dictatorship. And then we get to slaves and masters. And I guess the equivalent roughly for us today is employers and employees. Now the slaves, well, they were called to do anything their master wanted them to around the estate where they worked, in or out of the house, anywhere. Now in Colossae, the Christians, when they became Christians and they were slaves, they realized that their status was now equal to their masters. And so in their minds, they were thinking, I don't have to serve him anymore. I have equal status with him. Why should I do this job for him? So Paul's advice here is actually a corrective to those Christians who were serving their masters, to say, no, yes, you are the more vulnerable person in this pairing of slaves and masters, but you are to do whatever your master asks you to do. Serve him with all your heart. And if you hate your boss or you don't appreciate them, know that you are serving Christ, not just this boss who doesn't treat you well. You are serving the Lord. Serve him as if you're working for him. It'll change your outlook on your job, even with its difficulties. And I think Paul would say, the Lord has placed you in this role where you're in his providence, so fulfill your calling and serve him with all your heart. In verse 24, it says, you, the slave, or the employee, I guess, will receive an inheritance as your reward, just as your master will. In other words, on that score, we do have all the same status in Christ. And like a Christian who's an employer, a Christian who's an employee all their lives, well, you'll get the same reward. at the end of the day. Now, you may be in a job at the moment that you find boring and dull, as anyone would. But again, you can minister to your own heart, at least, by saying, I am serving the Lord. He's placed me here. I'll do the best I can. Maybe God's will is that you move on from your job. Well, as you're thinking about that in the day-to-day of today, do the best you can. There's a quote from a poet called George Herbert, and he said, make drudgery divine. And I think he was onto a good wicket there. Because if you behave badly as a worker, if you're just a people pleaser and you're not actually serving very well, well, you'll be, as Paul says, you'll be penalised just as badly as a bad master will. So do the job and do it to honour the Lord. So there you go, an interesting, very practical application of Paul for us today. And I hope that's been helpful. God bless.